Yeah.
Yeah. We're like figuring out how to like tell him he's kind of done and his career is kind of finished. And yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I see some people coming in. Let me know if you guys can hear me too. Is that okay? Perfect. Okay, so I'm just again gonna preface this. This is the end of class 5 for Mograph Mentor, and we have about 45 minutes left in the course, and I just figured we could kind of run through some. There's an echo. Okay, let me see. Maybe I should change the. There's an echo. Okay, let me see. Maybe I should change the. 1 second. Alright, I switched microphones. Let me know if that is better. Okay, so here we go. So 45 minutes left or so before the rest of tonight's session is over, and so we're just gonna kind of go through. I quit GTM echo gone, now a delay. Can you try refreshing the page really quick? Let me end the GoToMeeting. I think everyone else is out of there too. There may be a weird thing. Oh, okay, you got it. Okay, thanks for hanging in there. Okay, we're good. So we're just going to talk about some stuff in cinema. I think it's going to be kind of talking about some of the stuff that people were talking about on their projects, but as a whole, just a couple of skills. Let's just dive right into it. I want to show you guys kind of one of my favorite things in Cinema 4D, and this is going to be talking a little bit about the coffee cup problem that someone was experiencing a little bit before, and basically a lot of times what happens in cinema, right, is that if I have a cube here and I'm going to fillet it, right, and I'm going to take the fillet radius down to something much smaller, and then say I'm going to duplicate it and kind of move it over, and say I wanted to connect these two cubes, right? Say that I wanted them to be one object together now, right? And so let's think about the different ways that we can do this. The first way to do this is to right click and say connect objects and delete, but what you'll see is if I go inside, it leaves all of those inside faces there, which is really irritating, right? So if I go up to display lines, you can see all of those faces are just left on the inside, which they're now like inside each other. You have geometry that's inside one another. Not a problem. You could kind of go in there and start to select them, but look, like even though this is up here, it kind of cuts through and everything. So not really the right way to do it. I'll go back to display, go back to Garode. And so the obvious answer, right, is just like using a pathfinder in Cinema, you're going to use this bool, right? And this Boolean object is exactly what it sounds like. It's supposed to merge, cut, or you know, put together. It's the pathfinder in Cinema 4D. Basically, you have all these different options: union, subtract, intersect, etc. And so you can union these guys, right? And you can see that if I have this set to union, it creates two of them. You get some additional lines, and if we switch back to our line mode, sorry, not hidden line, regular line, you can see that basically I have no more internal geometry, right? So now these two pieces have totally merged with each other and are a single piece of geometry. And interestingly enough, if I then press C to make this editable, I end up with two pieces that I could then shift-click, merge, connect. Now I have a piece of geometry, right? That is just both of those two things. I'll go back to Garode shading so we can see it. So that's how you merge objects. But as you can see, I kind of put this nice filleting around the outside. And I don't have nice filleting where these two things intersect, right? And so what I can do now that I've made this a polygon object, right, is I could theoretically go in here and select all of these different pieces and fillet them, right? Now that sorry, that's UL, by the way, to give you loop selection. And what loop selection will do is basically select an entire ring around the object, which is exactly what this is. So if I click, for instance, like one of these guys, you can see that it will, I have to find the right spot, but you can see that it's trying to just basically make an entire loop around the object. And so what we can do is we can click there to get that one. I can click MS for my bevel. You can see that when I start to bevel it, it's broken. The long and short way, you know, to say that basically this is not a super great workflow, because now my geometry is super editable. It's no longer procedural. Everything's kind of broken with it. But just for the sake of argument, I'm going to come up here to select all my points, optimize, and hopefully that will then put them together. I'll come back to my edge mode, MS, and now you can see that I can bevel this now that I've optimized those shapes, and I can add a little bit of subdivision to get some filleting, and I could theoretically match the settings that I had and whatever. But now look at this. Like, this is fine, and it looks pretty good. When I render it, I get this nice edge. But I have editable geometry, and these are no longer cubes. I can no longer animate them or anything like that. So I want to show you guys what I think is one of the coolest tricks that I found out about in Cinema, and hopefully you guys can learn it as well. So what we'll do, right, is we'll start with the tube, basically gonna mock up this like coffee cup idea. Click on our tube, click on our move tool, open that up, kind of have the general shape of a coffee cup, right? We will then add a little fillet to our edges, right? Because coffee cups, again, are kind of rounded on the edges. Nothing is kind of a perfect right angle. And then I think, too, I'm just going to add a couple more rotation segments to get it to be a little bit smoother around the outside so it doesn't look so fragmented. I know I don't have a bottom or a top right now, but I'll deal with that in a moment. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to make that bottom, right? So I'm going to make a cylinder. I'm going to make it smaller. I'm going to open it up to be a little bit larger just so it starts to intersect with the thing. I'll go into my side view and I'll move it not all the way to the bottom, right, but to there. And then finally, just again, I'm going to do something really simplistic here, is I'm going to take my cycloid shape. I'm going to come over, I'm going to switch my view to the side view. I'm going to find my settings. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the axis of it so that I can see it the right way for me, which actually I think I may just have to rotate it. It's going to be easier. And rotate it down 90. Move it over there. Come back to this view. Maybe I'll scale it down a little bit. Right, basically we're making a coffee cup handle. And there are all kinds of settings in here for like the amount of this where I can kind of bow it out. Is this, yeah, the kind of curvature of it and things like that. But so I'm making this handle like that, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a circle spline, right, just a circle, just like that. Let me turn off these two objects so we can see them really quick. Sorry. Take this circle spline, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit C to make it editable, and I'm going to flatten it. Right, so now it's flat that way, and I'm going to scale it down and actually make it a little bit thicker. But basically, I want an oval down there, right? And so that what's going to happen now is when I make a sweep nerve and I take my flat circle and that cycloid, I'm going to get this kind of coffee arm shape. But what you'll see is that I did it the wrong direction, right? I basically, instead of making a tall, not very wide circle, I made a short, very wide one. So I'm just going to kind of do the opposite of that. I'm going to scrunch it back up, put it in a little bit, and then what you'll see here is now I have something that kind of resembles a coffee cup edge, right? That's basically a coffee cup side. What I might do now is take my sweep NURBS and go to this scale, and I'll add some points by holding Control Command there. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just pinch these ends in, and what you can see happens, right, is you get those little pinches. And obviously a coffee cup is much more round than that, so I'll just change the profile of this spline again to be round, right? So now I've got kind of the gist of what my coffee cup handle might look like. And so when I turn back on my coffee cup, now I've got a handle, right? And what I can do here as well is I can just adjust the scale of that circle to adjust the thickness of that handle. And I think now that my cycloid is still editable, I can kind of come in here and continue to crank out these settings, and I can really just kind of fine-tune the look of this coffee cup handle without even really having to model anything, right? So I've got a coffee cup handle there. But there's some things going on, right? So the things that I have problems with is that there's some weird janky geometry here, which is maybe what, sorry, I think it was Travis was mentioning about the geometry happening there. And then the same thing is kind of happening while we don't even see it, right? On the very bottom, we're also not getting nice connecting geometry between the base and the bottom of the cup, and then you'll also see that that's the case on the inside, right? So there's actually a super easy way to solve this, and I'm just like so glad that Cinema has introduced something like this recently. And the way that you do that essentially is you're still going to do the bool. So we find our bool over here, and then we put both of our objects in there. We switch it to intersect. Or sorry, to union, my fault. And so this is now one object with all of this glorious geometry to come with it. And then there's a couple of settings down here that we can check in order to help us. But the first thing that I want to do is, because I want to add a bevel here, I want to take the bevel off of the main tube because I'm going to basically add it to my whole object at the same time. Okay, so now I have this object here. And I know that I said I was going to take this up, but just for the sake of being able to see what's going on a little more cleanly, I'm going to take it down as well. And then the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my circle, which is, again, if I look at the circle, it is just this part, the profile. And what I'm going to try and do is you can see how many kind of polygons this sweep NURBS is creating. It's creating a ton of polygons, and that's to do with this angle down here. And as I increase this angle, you can see that my handle becomes less and less subdivided. And I'm just going to try and get the number of polys that it's using down to something a little bit more manageable. And basically the concept of this angle is how many degrees around the outside do I have to turn, quote unquote, before I place another point. And there's other types in here. Something that maybe makes more sense is like natural, which is just a straight number of points, right? 8 gives you 8 subdivisions. 2, I think it's actually per hemisphere or whatever. Excuse me. It is essentially, this circle has 4 points. It's saying subdivide each of these 2 more times. So that's why you're getting not exactly the right number, but you can use that to more easily analyze your shape, right? And then we can do the same thing here as well, as we can take down the number of subdivisions that this has, and you can see they just added a bunch, but we can take that down to be fewer and fewer and fewer until we get something that's a little bit less hectic to work with. Right, so now look at that. Now I just have far fewer polygons, and it's not driving me crazy. The final thing that I'll do here is I'll turn off the caps, because, again, we pinch these ends, so I don't have caps there. I don't need to add the additional geometry. Anyway, okay, now, sorry that was a bit of a tangent, but to the most important thing, and I'm actually going to demonstrate this in just a plain old file. Now that I went to all the trouble of making that, we'll go back to it in a moment. If I take these 2 things and I put them in a bool, and I set them to union, these settings that I want to choose, right, is the first thing I want to do is I want to create a single object, and I want to select intersection. Those are the 2 most important ones, right? And then do you guys remember the 2 ways that we can put something into a deformer, right? The first way is that we can take a cube and make its child the deformer, right? We can just kind of like take the cube and start to do stuff with it. But the other way that we can do is we can group our object, right? So we can group this. We can find our null that we've just made as a group, and we can put a bevel deformer in there. And what you'll see is that, bam, I have a nice beveled edge there. We can then use our angle threshold, which we talked about last week, to not bevel the faces. But now you can see that I have a perfect kind of bevel that kind of goes on those intersections. But here's my absolute favorite part, is that say that this wasn't just cubes or something, say that I didn't necessarily want to bevel everything, is there a way just to get this selection? And something I found when I was in here looking at the help is that there is this really cool help thing about note in conjunction with the bool object under the circumstance described this page will create an invisible selection tag named I, which can be inserted into the field and will only bevel the cut edges. So that's a very fancy way of saying if you put I here, you just get the bevel between the 2, right? I'm no longer beveling these outside faces. I'm just beveling where they connect. So that way I can fillet these to whatever amount I want, and I'm still just getting a nice little bevel that I can adjust totally independently in here, right? And so that's like a really nice way of making objects join a little bit better. So that's the exact same thing that I'm going to do in our coffee cup, and we'll have a little bit more geometry here, so it might get a little bit messier, but hopefully it still behaves for the most part. So we need to go to our bool. We need to make sure that we've said create single object and select intersections. We now need to take this down to much smaller, and we need to turn on our angle threshold, and we need to turn up our subdivisions. We'll take that to 1. And so you can see here that we are just beveling those pieces that are happening there, but the geometry is getting a little bit messy. But even there, I think that it's pretty janky, but you can see that it starts to fix that edge. So how do we remedy this, right? So the things that we might want to do are, first of all, kind of play with the way that we're crunching the edges of that shape, right? So we might want to pull these up, right, so that we can begin to have a little bit more geometry there. We also might want to check to make sure that this didn't mess us up, which I don't think it did, but okay, it didn't. Start to pull these up to have more basically contact between the surface of the cylinder and the surface of this coffee mug ring. So I'm opening those up, and then the other thing that I might want to do is to increase the subdivisions of the cube itself, right? So I might add some height segments so that, as you can see, it kind of now like localizes these little clusters, and I start to get a little bit cleaner edges. And then I might even go back to my higher rotation radius, and you'll see that I'm getting something that feels still a little bit janky, but not as bad. And we'll just try basically moving this guy in and out until we get the right amount. I will then adjust this, and that's getting there. And oftentimes cinema is just about finding those perfect numbers where everything makes sense. And so as we can see there, I am starting to get these kind of nice little highlights there. We're still getting some jank down there. So what we would need to do in this situation is we would need to really clean up this sweep NURB, right? And we'd want to go in here and to play with that. We can also maybe play with the angle threshold to see if we can get it to a point where it starts to only smooth the ones that we need it to. Oh, this needs to go higher. Aha, there we go. Right, see, now we're getting just a nice little bevel there. And we're getting, oh, jank on the bottom. And we can just play with these curves until we get something that looks a little bit nicer. That looks pretty good. That looks pretty good up there. I'm going to try and increase the nice. Okay, great. Now we have nice kind of smooth edges for both of those guys. Find the right spot. Bam. Okay, I think we're doing okay there. So that's a really good way of putting your two objects together. I think, again, it's better demonstrated here when you have more simplistic objects, but using that bevel deformer with two different objects can help. And obviously, too, if we take this sweep object and we use something that is a little bit less kind of confusing, which could be, like, for instance, a torus, and we can slice this to 0 to 180, which is going to give us basically this macaroni shape, and scale it down, and just for the sake of an easy handle to make, if we put that in there, you can see that we get much kind of more cooperative 40 edges there that don't break up quite as much. But this is a bit temperamental. Forgive me for not working correctly on the example, but hopefully this part here will save you some help. It definitely saved me some things. And just while we talk on top of that, I also want to talk really quickly about selections really quick, because we can use them for all sorts of things. And one of the places that they're the most common is in extrude NURBs, right? And so if I have a, let's just say N side, right, I'm going to put it inside my extrude NURB, I'm extruding it, I'm going to come over to my caps tab of this guy, I'm going to make fillet caps, I'm going to set 5 steps, and 1, or 3 radius, and then so I'm going to make, just for the sake of demonstration here, I'm going to show you some materials. That if I make a red material, right, and a blue material and a green material, something that you can do that's really helpful is that inside of these extrude NURBs, if you click on the little thing, there's this selection option here. And extrude NURBs, and actually all NURBs, have something built in called C1 for cap 1. So if you just put C1 in there, you'll see that it only gets put on the front cap. You can put R1 for only the front rounding, right? And then this would be R2 and C2. So if I put C2 here, it gives you just the back, right? So that's a super helpful way to texture different things. So something I can do here is I can do C1, copy that holding Control Command, C2, that puts it on the back. I'll take my blue one, right, do R1, copy it, R2, and then if I put this green texture all the way on the right, it's going to cover everything, but if I take the ones that I put custom selections on and move them to the right of it, now you can see that I have a really easy way to texture the kind of extrusion of my objects, the rounding, and the faces of these extrude nerves. And the same thing happens, obviously, when I take, instead of my extrude, if I take, we're going to do a sweep, basically, and I need to, sorry, I'm not going to use a circle, I'm going to use an arc. Where's the arc? Arc. And then if we take our sweep nerve, we put these both in there, and I did them in the wrong order, flip them around. If I do the same thing here, right, if I take a fillet cap, 5, 1, fillet cap, 5, 1, right, and then if I take these materials and put them here, you'll see that I get the exact same thing, right? Even though it's not text, it's just a sweep nerve, you'll still be able to separate the rounding, the face, and the actual kind of body or main extrusion of the nerves that you've got. So that's really helpful, and I think for building mats and things like that, or if you want like the front face to be glass but the sides of text to be concrete or something, this is a really easy way to do it. So that one is helpful. So the next thing that I wanted to do quickly is actually jump into After Effects so that I can make sure that I'm hitting a couple of those notes that we were talking about during the review. Is I want to talk about maybe some of that UI stuff a little bit. And so we're going to look basically at exactly what I was talking about before, which is how to create some kind of cool pulsating ring effects using the effects inside of After Effects. And so what we're going to do, make a new comp. I'm going to make a new solid and call it background. I'm going to make it dark gray, almost black. I'm going to go back to my solid settings and hit make comp size to make it big. I am going to see if I have plugins on this computer. If not, we will do it manually. Control 5. Okay, so we don't have form, so if you don't have form either, you are in for a treat to learn how to make form stuff all out of After Effects itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a shape layer, right? Inside this shape layer, and if you guys haven't played with these shape layers from scratch, this is probably the most powerful thing inside of After Effects. Like, I really like these shape layers, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff with them. If you're used to working in Illustrator, you can do a lot of very similar things, right? So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to make a group, an empty group, and I'm going to call this circle base, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click add, and I'm going to add a ellipse to that circle base. I'm going to call it circle base path, right? And then I'm going to click on my group and I'm going to add a fill to it. So now I've got a fill that's just affecting this group, right? And I'm going to make this white. And then what I can do here now is I can take my circle and I can make this smaller, right? So now I have a single dot. You may ask what, let me make it a little bit bigger too. Now what you can do that's really cool about these shape layers is you can add all of these weird things down here, and one of them being the repeater, which is what I'm going to look at right now. And so I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger so we can all see it on screen. Now I have that dot there. And by the way, clicking this button or Command-Shift-H, I think I talked about it last time, will kind of hide show that selection box, and that is really helpful here. But the repeater does exactly what it says it does, is it just makes anything above it in the group order for, oh, sorry, I see your question, Steve. I'll come back to it in just a minute. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, so we can add this repeater basically, and what we can do now is we can just make a bunch of dots, right? We can just make a bunch of dots here, and then inside this transform repeater, we can basically choose how much we're offsetting each of these dots by, right? So I want to make 37 dots, and each one's going to move 26 pixels over to the right. Something else you can do is if you make this like 40 and then you make this negative 20, it'll basically center it for you so that you can work from the center out, because it's basically building out 40 to the right and then shifting the whole indices of all of them back down. But the cool thing that we can do here too is that we can chain these repeaters, right? So if I take this repeater now and I hit Command D for duplicate, and instead of moving it on the x-axis, say I want to move it on the y-axis, right now I've just got this entire grid of dots on this one little shape layer that I did almost nothing to, right? And I've got these two separate properties that I can use to animate the position. You know, I could do these weird kind of halftone scale wipes, right? So these shape layers are absolutely. Is there a way to mix textures in physical render like they do in Octane and all our renderers? How do you mean mix? Do you mean like a two-sided material in Octane, or do you mean just like if I wanted to put a like a logo on top of a piece of concrete or something? Because the answer, like if you want to mix them so that you can have like yeah, I guess I need to know, because there are ways to do it. You just if you have a specific example, we can maybe talk through it, because that is I know one of the big shortcomings of the physical renderer. Anyway, so then the final thing that we can do here as well is that we can add a wiggle transform, right? And what you'll notice, what the wiggle transform does is it just like essentially. Let me make this guy bigger so we can see it. But it essentially, whatever transform options you put in this guy, it's just going to wiggle your object that amount. And so if I make this guy bigger and then I turn off these repeaters, what you'll see is that this plays, it just kind of wiggles the size of this shape, right? Okay, yeah. I can show you how to do that really in a moment. And so currently I have this circle base path with a wiggle transform on top of it that is then being filled with the color white and then repeated twice. But what you'll notice now is that at the moment this wiggle is affecting all of them the same. But if I move it down, I believe, to the bottom underneath the repeaters, and then I scale this way down to like 10? 110? Maybe something even much smaller. Oh, I'm sorry. It's because I've scaled this circle way up. So if I scale the circle down, and then I can scale this amount up, and you'll see what happens is now I have this crazy pattern here that has a bunch of dots at different sizes, and as I play, as I just scrub through this, right, I'm now getting this kind of jittery form effect, right? So now I've got these different pieces that are randomly creating this kind of cool texture, and I can see that inside of this guy I can change like how fast it goes, I can change the spatial phase, I can change random seed and stuff like that. So you can play with these, and again, we're just building this system, right? So I can now still come in here and change how close these are together, right? And change how close they are in this direction as well. So I can create these kind of really cool looking DNA strip sort of things that just play out. And again, this is one shape layer with like 5 effects on it, which is really cool. And then what we can do, right, is we can again continue to layer this with more effects. Like, so something that we might want to try would be polar coordinates, which is just going to not do anything. And the reason is because we want to pre-comp this first. Move all attributes, and then we'll use polar coordinates, and we'll up this, and you'll start to see that we can get some really weird shapes like that. We want to go rect to polar, right? So now I've got this, and actually I'm pretty sure I didn't need to pre-comp, I just didn't turn the volume up, or the amount up. So I'm going to come back to where we were here, paste that same effect, and we've got the same thing. And now you can see that this is kind of animating in this interesting way. This is just animating in this interesting way with basically just a single shape layer. And so what we want to do in order to get it to be a full circle, I'm pretty sure, is we just want to move it apart so that it goes across the entire And then if we turn polar coordinates, now we have a full circle, right? And so something that we can adjust here as well would be like now we maybe don't need as many on the Y, space them out a little bit more, right? And so now I've got some pretty sweet things with just some very basic properties. And so now I've got this kind of cool animating. It's going way too fast, which is going to be my wiggle transform. We'll turn that to like 2. And so now you'll see that I've got this really cool undulating circle path thing. And then what you can do on top of that, right, is maybe we'll spin this, right? We'll set a keyframe there, over here, spin it 360, and so now we've got this kind of like weird warping thingy. And how we can get this to behave, and it's interesting that we look at why this did this. And what is happening here, right, is that you have to remember that After Effects has an internal order of operations, right? And so the way that polar coordinates works is, remember when I had to pull this thing out in order to get it to make that full circle? Basically, if I set these rotation keyframes, right, it's going to be using this weird off-center or off-angle texture to do polar coordinates out of, right? So that's why you're getting these weird spirals. And there's something kind of cool about that, right? But that's not exactly what I was going for. And so there's a couple different ways to deal with this, right? The ways that we can deal with it are, first, by just pre-comping the layer. But second, one of the coolest things that I use is an effect called transform, which basically it gives you all of the same transform properties, but it comes after that polar coordinates, right? So now I can just take this rotation and I can spin it, and you get the behavior. Very cool. Can you set all of those properties to audio wavelengths? You can. I'll see if I don't know if I have some audio anywhere, but we can look at that really quickly. And you can't set necessarily each individual circle in this specific situation to a different piece of audio, but you could make different rings, right? So you have one ring for the drums, one ring for the hi-hat, one ring for the whatever. But anyway, so I'm going to take this rotation here, move it over, animate 1. So then now I've got this kind of spinning, weird, undulating, cool thing, right? And I can still just kind of come in here, and this whole thing is a system, so I can just build it out to do some other cool stuff. So, but I want to move on really quickly to get to Chris's question. I have this issue where I don't want to put things down once I've started making them. So something that you could do on top of this now is like add an echo effect, which I don't know if you guys use echo, but it basically creates these like trails. So it kind of can smear them, right? And so now if I play this, I'm getting errors in my After Effects, but you can see that it creates this kind of cool smeary, tracy little guy, right? And so that's an example of like a very simple property. I took one circle on this shape layer, right? And then I just repeated it and duplicated and added a bunch of effects. And now I have this kind of cool smeary line doohickey right there as well. Okay, so back to cinema really quickly. And it's actually quite easy to have something basically reveal underneath itself, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a sphere here and just really quickly light it, just to be able to get a little bit of volumetric, or not volumetric, but some realistic lighting. So I'm going to set a target tag, put the sphere there so it looks at it, make sure my light is casting shadows, make sure it's an area light, make it bigger, move it over there, move it over there, I'll duplicate it and put one back here. I didn't duplicate it. Floor. Okay, got it. So say that for all intents and purposes, this is my very rudimentary lighting setup for this sphere that we're going to demo here. A little bit rotated. Okay, cool. Okay, so let's say that for my first texture, I'm going to create something that, why don't we just do like some black with like some weird lava stuff coming out of it. So we're going to go to, let me actually first explain the technique, and then we'll kind of try and create something cool about it. So the technique is actually quite simple, and one of the coolest things that you can do in Cinema is use this thing called the layer shader, right? And so if I click on my color property, and just like you load in a Fresnel or gradient or whatever else, this is option here called layer. And what layer shaders do is it basically gives you like a Photoshop style stack of layers. So just to make that very simple, right, you can take a gradient, and then I can take another gradient, and I can flip this one by right-clicking and clicking invert, and then I can simply adjust the opacity of this guy, and you can see that it's basically just a layer stack, right? So I can now adjust the opacity between these two different things. I have some different blending modes, so if I wanted to multiply the other guy in there, so you have this layer stack, which is really powerful, right? The other thing that's in here that's really cool is you have these different kind of Photoshop-esque effects. So if you want things like hue, saturation, and lightness, you can get some kind of basic image editing tools up in there as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two colors, right? I'm just going to make a red like we normally do, and I'm going to make a blue. And then if you're familiar with Photoshop or After Effects and the concept of masking, that's exactly what we're going to do here as well, is we're just going to basically mask out where we want the red and where we want the blue. And the, or the purple, now that I've edited it. And so to do this really, really easily, let's just look at the checkerboard shader. And I think we can find that under Surfaces, Checkerboard, right? And so if I just put this on my sphere right now, and I click render, you would get exactly what you'd expect, right? You get this kind of checkerboard looking thing with it's going to have black in a checkerboard shape and white in a checkerboard shape, even though it's mapped to this cube, right? And I can change the mapping, but because it's a primitive, the UVs match that, right? But what basically I want to try and do, right, is I want to say, hey, blue shader, be where the white is, and purple shader, be where the black is, right? And Cinema 4D has a very kind of complicated. It's not complicated. It's just kind of convoluted. The way that you do that, and I'll just show it, is you put the mask. So the checkerboard is my mask under the layer that you want it to be masking, i.e. the white to be going through, and then you change this to layer mask. And then what you'll see there is exactly this, right, where the blue part, the blue, which is above the mask, is coming through on the white parts of that checkerboard, and the purple is coming through on the black parts, or rather that the blue is just not coming through, right? The purple is just underneath it. This is essentially transparent. And so that's the gist of how you do this. But the thing that is even more powerful, right, is that you can nest layer shaders inside of here, right? So something I might do here is I might come in here and I might make a noise, and I'll come to noise and I will drop my contrast way down just to kind of get like a base layer. So I have this kind of just generic noise, and then what I might do is I might take an effect like a brightness contrast and drop the gamma way down so that it gets darker. Not quite that far. Something down there, charcoal. Then I might take like a Fresnel shader and I might flip it and I might set this to multiply, so I'm just getting some darkening around the edges, right? And then what I can do, and I'll call this black, what I might do then is I might make an entire second layer shader and call this red, right? And then I might come in here and choose noise, right? And I might choose some red values. It's kind of like a dark fiery red. And then I might change that so it kind of looks like lava, right? I'll increase the contrast a little bit so we get something a little more lava-like. The other thing is you get this noise preview over here, so you can click something and find something until it looks a little lava-y. Might go a little more orange, actually. That'll smooth it out a little bit, right? We got this groovy lava lamp looking thing. And then what I might do too here is do the same thing where I might take a Fresnel, but I'll make it on the edges much brighter, right? And so invert them so that the orange is around the outside there, and then I'll add this on top again, just like in Photoshop, right? Sorry, in order to add it, you need to make this part black. And now so you can see that I have this kind of like nice outer orange shell here. And then what we can do is, now that I have these two different things, is I can make my matte layer, right? So I'll take my noise, I'll put my blistered turbulence, I'll set the contrast so it's very sharp, right? And I can see that this is what my mask is going to look like. And then I can play with these low clip, high clip values to see basically like how much of it comes through, right? So I'll maybe make it a little bit softer, maybe make it a little bit bigger. Try and find something that feels right. Okay, that's not too bad. And then, again, what I do here now is I put this between and I set layer mask. And now, you can't see it necessarily in the object preview, but you can see it up here, right? Now I've just got these two mixed textures where I have this black on the outside and this this crazy lava on the inside. And the thing that happens here as well is that we can then take this layer shader, right, that has all of our stuff built inside of it, has this whole lava thing, and maybe let's take it and copy it and put it in our bump channel, right? So I'm going to paste the bump. I'm going to paste it in here, and then maybe what I might do is I'm going to go in here, right? And I know that I no longer need any of this stuff. I just need it to be totally black because I don't want any bumper. Maybe I just want a little bit of noise to be like super subtly and soft. And the black, and then I might take the contrast down and the brightness down. So I'm just getting this very dull gray, right, for my, yeah, with some spots, perfect. And then in this guy, right, I don't need it to be red anymore, and I don't need a Fresnel, but I might want these to now go back to being black and white so that I can get some more intense textures. And so what you'll see now is when I render this, is not only am I getting different colors, but you can see that this red is now like bumping out, right, because I put this bump on it. And then what I might want to do on top of this, again, this is just kind of how I sketch in my process, but I might then take some smaller noise and lay it on top just for some additional variation, right? Maybe up the contrast of that as well. And then the same thing too is what we can do is we can move that into a reflectance channel too. So if I want to take this and I want to basically add a reflectance, I can then come down to the layer color and just add this in here, right? So if I paste the channel, and again, I don't necessarily not need that to be like that, is because I've got the Fresnels built in it too already. And so if I then come to my lights and I click on them and I turn on this show in reflection, we might start to see some of that reflectiveness, right, where I'm getting a few of those little hot spots here based on that light, right? So now I've kind of taken that texture and I've layered it. Is that kind of what you meant by blend materials? Is that I assume is that correct? This is a really powerful technique that I don't think people utilize nearly enough, being able to kind of put these two different materials on the same object together. Looks kind of gross. And what I noticed is that my bump needs to actually be inverted so that it comes out. Yeah, that looks nice. And so I might then go into my reflectance and make sure it's turned on, first of all. Oh yeah, now you can definitely see the glossiness of this guy as compared, right? Now we've got that really kind of cool gloss that's happening there. So yeah, I think we're gonna probably call it there. It is 10:30 now, and I don't want to go too long, but I will. I know that this went a little bit quick. I tried to cram in a bunch there towards the end, but just like last week, this VOD will go up in the Slack channel soon. So feel free to kind of come back during the week and watch it to see if you can pick up on any of those smaller things. But as a whole, basically what I would say is they're the kind of, just like we talked about last week with Mograph, just like we're talking about here in After Effects with kind of base shape layer stuff, and just as we're talking about here with textures, the key to animating and the key to building realistic, cool looking things is just like layering levels of complexity, right? Like you take a couple of very simple elements and you just kind of additionally put more and more layers of things that are difficult on top of it, and that's the way that you tackle these giants, these huge projects that you feel like you're not going to know how to do them. You just start one layer at a time and you start layering on top. And hopefully this was helpful to everybody, and we're going to do for next week an entire session of this kind of stuff. So please work on your video a little bit. It would be extremely helpful to me if you guys posted your questions a little bit in advance, just so that I could make sure that I can get to them. I know there were some people here that had questions that I didn't get to tonight, and I'm sorry, but again, please bring those up next week and we'll go over them. I'll post the link to this video in Slack shortly, but I hope everyone learned something. Thank you all for coming to week 5, and we will see you next week. Thank you so much.